What's up, world? This is Maxwell 3000 Productions. I am Maxwell 3000. I am excited to bring you another edition of Book Club with my big bro, Tommy Dixon. Tommy, how are you this morning?
Bro, how you doing today?
I am well. I am very well. And I'm really excited to do this. Got another one of maybe one of my favorite authors, I guess, or maybe one of the authors that I've read the most in my life. And so we are reviewing A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. Uh, Ernest Hemingway is this guy who is really, to some people, considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest, authors of the 20th century. Now, I wouldn't go so far to say that, but folks have said that. He was a Pulitzer Prize winner for Old Man in the Sea in 1953, won the Nobel Prize for Literature the next year. Kind of an interesting story behind that. And more than the two biggest things probably that Hemingway is known for is really being that bridge in between that kind of modernist era in literature and kind of the lost generation or the disillusioned generation. Um, and then also he's known for kind of his pioneering in writing with his less is more uh, uh, perspective towards writing, really kind of concise but vigorous language. And credited that from his editor in an early job with the Kansas newspaper, who was, his style guide was use short sentences, use short paragraphs, be positive, not negative, and use vigorous language again. And that really, if you look at his writing as a whole, that's really sums up his perspective towards writing. He's also one of those guys that kind of can represent all of the best and all of the worst of masculinity. Would you kind of agree with that, Tommy?
Yeah, I would say so. Like, we kind of described him as a man's man, if you would, like a adventure seeker. He lived an exciting life. He was always looking. Today, you might call him an adrenaline junkie. I could imagine that. It's I don't view those as the negatives, but then as far as the maybe some of his dealings with women in his life and things like that, is the other side of that coin, where he's not cast in the best light.
Yeah, yeah. And you said, he was an adventurer and he really did a lot. And we have kind of decided not to go in to his life in depth. Would really like to maybe do that another time.
Yeah.
But because of all that he actually did in his life, and because of these great characters that he pulled from his experiences, sometimes the line gets blurred between his real life and the characters in his books.
No, we
Um,
we had that experience in this novel as we were reading it. Like, man, is this a story about his life experience, or is this a fiction that he created? It's kind of hard to tell at times.
well, and to me, that's one of the amazing things about his art is that it's both, right? It is his life experiences, but it's not just his life experiences in the war, and we'll talk about it more. But it's more of a cumulative of his whole life that goes into these works. But it still is from his experiences, whether it was he himself or somebody he knew. Um, but yeah, kind of at I guess at his core, he was this sensitive, romantic artist and adventurer, and really kind of lived his life that way. Born 1899, July 21st, 1899, right at the turn of the century. Grew up in a solid upper middle class home in Oak Park, Illinois, right outside of Chicago. His father was a doctor. His mother was a supreme musician, a great voice talent, turned down a contract with the New York Metropolitan Opera, and actually made more money giving music and voice lessons and writing sheet music than the father did as a physician early on. Um, and so there's a lot that we can go into about his family. We talked a lot about how he and his family is a good case study for genetic mental health, right, or genetic mental illness. I heard one guy say that he had heavy genetic loading for mental illness, and his mother was a very domineering person who kind of ruled over the house with an iron fist and was abusive to the children, her husband, and the live-in domestic servants. Solid upper middle class, right? Um, and the father, he suffered from horrible mood swings. And looking back at it now, we might say he probably had bipolar. You know, and we may talk about it later, may not, but we know that his father goes on to commit suicide. Hemingway commits suicide at pretty early age, and then he had two siblings and a granddaughter that ends up committing suicide in the 20th century. I think the granddaughter committed suicide in 1982, if I remember
It's
that correctly.
crazy. Like I've never heard of a family that suffered that many deaths by suicide and just that immediate family group.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that is very interesting. But I've after reading some other things, is that it is kind of rare to find it that close in the immediate family, but it's something that tends to be prevalent in the family history if you look at it. I've kind of come to find out. Um, Growing up, Hemingway wasn't a great student. He wasn't a great athlete. He tried a lot of things. His mother forced him to learn the cello. He was in the school orchestra, and the editor for the school paper and the yearbook. And that's I guess that was his always kind of his calling was to write. You know, and he really gets his chops as a reporter, a journalist. He starts out as a journalist, very young, 18 years old when World War One cranks up. Tries to join the U.S. Army, but is rejected for poor eyesight. Um, Ends up joining the American Red Cross and goes to the front lines in Italy. And really, that's kind of sets the stage for our novel. But not just as far as with the relationships, though, it's not just his time during World War One, but these other relationships as well that kind of help mold the plot and the characters. Um, Not long after he's there on the front, is he injured from mortar shrapnel. Um, After receiving these injuries during this bombardment, it says he saves two Italian soldiers. He was decorated by the Italian army, and all at the young age of 18. Um, so he comes back after his injury, begins working with the Toronto Star and still really getting his chops as a writer, and has an opportunity to go to Europe as a correspondence journalist. And so this really gives us what a lot of people call the Paris era for Hemingway. And this was a really important time. It was very cheap to live in Paris at the time, and a lot of modernist or modern era artists are kind of living and hanging out there. We think about Pablo Picasso. We think about James Joyce, the Irish poet. We think about F. Scott Fitzgerald, or some of these modernist writers that come out of that Paris scene. And you just got to know that Hemingway's probably just soaking all that up, you know.
I think they referred to him and Fitzgerald as having a friendly and competitive relationship. That relationship kind of helped to fuel and drive his writing career as far as giving him a somebody to go head to head against.
Yeah, like a peer, and you're very right. Hemingway said in an interview that it was The Great Gatsby that inspired him to write a novel. Um, and so, kind of towards the end, I guess, of this maybe Paris era, or during that time, he had taken some trips to Spain. He had taken trips all over. He had done writing pieces for fishing across Europe, trout fishing to different places and things like that. He covered the Greco-Turkish War, which I don't know much about. I was reminded of it in kind of my looking at Hemingway's life over the last couple of weeks, and a predecessor to World War II. You know, that we think about the Spanish War, which later Hemingway is a correspondence for, as maybe being the dress rehearsal for World War II. But the Greco Turkish War certainly played a part. But I think in my memory of the textbooks, it was a very minor, almost footnote. Um, so he's doing a lot of work, but he's also doing a lot of hanging out. And he takes this trip kind of for his birthday to Spain with this group of expatriates. Is that the word? Did I say that correctly? Do you know what that means? Expatriates? It's like a group of folks that don't live in their home country for some reason. You know what I mean? They're not in their patriot country. So it's this group of Americans that either served in World War I or were still living in Europe and in Paris around that time. And anyways, they take this trip to Spain kind of around Hemingway's birthday. And during that time, he writes his first novel, Sun Also Rises. And it's not funny. It's very admirable, I guess. But to me, it's a little funny. It's like every Hemingway novel, somebody says is just the best thing smoking. You know what I mean?
That too, yeah.
And you'll read that A Sun Also Rises is Hemingway's best novel. But I've read that A Farewell Arms is his best novel. Not only the best novel, but his best novel, but the best novel ever written. And then I know people that'll say the same thing about For Whom the Bell Tolls, which he wrote after the Spanish Civil War. Anyways, you know, he really gets this time to kind of grow as an artist while kind of earning his chops as a writer, you know. And it's that time in Paris that really shapes his writing more than anything. During that time, he goes through two wives, and we just don't have time to really get into all the aspects of that. And when his second wife becomes pregnant, she wants to move back to the States. They move back to the United States and kind of travel around for a little bit until in December of 1928, while in New York, Hemingway receives news that his father had killed himself. And the story goes is that Hemingway had just sent a letter telling his father that, hey, you don't have to worry about finances anymore. Everything's going to be all right. I'm going to take care of you, all that type of stuff. And kind of before the letter can reach his father, he commits suicide. And Hemingway really kind of blamed his mother and his mother's domineering relationship for some of that. And you know, kind of identified maybe with his father's struggle and made the remark that, you know, he was going to go the same way, or that he would probably go the same way. And, you know, like we said before, we find that to be true. It is after this that the family settles in Key West, Florida, and that is really kind of the second era of Hemingway's writing career, the Key West era, and it's there that he writes this novel, A Farewell to Arm, and you know, it didn't take him very long. He moved down to Key West right there at the end of 1928, the beginning of 1929. A Farewell to Arms is completed in September, and he rewrote the ending over a dozen times, and once again considered to be his seminal work. There's a lot that goes on during that time. Like I said, he's on his second wife. He's had 2 children, one by first wife, Hadley Richardson. Now he's with his second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer. Has 2 children by Pauline. It is Pauline's first child, Hemingway's second, Patrick. It's Patrick's delivery that inspires the kind of the ending to A Farewell to Arms. And so that's just that evidence that it's not just that time in World War I that created this story. It's these other experiences as well that helped mold this story together that he set in World War I based on the experiences that he saw, right? And so then there lies, that mastery, as you like to say sometimes. Has another son, Greg, and I want to be sensitive to all things, and I don't know really how he or she may want to be referred to, because this child did end up undergoing gender transition surgery, but born a male, transitioned to a female in the 90s, and it was a difficult birth, and that had a lot of impact. Those births and those relationships with his children had a lot of impact on Hemingway. And all stories go that Hemingway was a great and loving father when he was around, but he was hardly around. Traveling
on the road doing his work,
or for pleasure under the disguise of work,
doing work,
right? Or just the mental escapism of not wanting to deal with his mental illness, and all those different things. It's in 1933 that Hemingway goes on his first safari, and so some of the things that's very kind of detrimental to his character is kind of his dealing with animals, I guess. And in Spain earlier, he became infatuated with bullfighting, which is, I understand, to be a culturally significant and kind of artistic thing. But my contemporary perspective on bullfighting is that is horrifically inhumane, right? And then, as I said, in 1933, Hemingway and Pauline go to Kenya on his first safari, and he engages in big game hunting, and there's pictures of him killing these animals, and he's standing over their carcass just smiling, just as proud as he could be, right?
Yeah. And
his guide is just looking down in mourning. Is what it appears to me. Maybe I'm putting something on the picture, some of those pictures in that, but that's what it communicates to me, And so just another one of those things that's like maybe represents that duality of Hemingway. Like, yes, this is, love that being outdoors and being in nature, and loving this adventure, but it expressing itself in this horrific way, right? A lot more goes on in his life. He goes through 2 more wives, the Spanish Civil War. From the Spanish Civil War comes From Whom the Bell Tolls. Somebody might say that's his greatest work, right? Somebody may say that to you. I have read all 3 of those particular novels, and I do enjoy them all. but I do contend, and I think Hemingway agreed. I know Hemingway agreed that his short stories and his novellas were some of his best work. And you know, we got to mention his time in World War II before I skip to The Old Man in the Sea. We really got to mention what he does in World War II as a war correspondent. I mean, he is there at the Normandy landing,
He was there
19
for some
June,
big moments
the whole
in
damn
history.
war, right? Like
Yeah.
in the European theater, you know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
But yeah, the Normandy landing, June 1944, liberation of Paris, August 1944, and through that time, had a lot of concussion injuries from kind of the mortar rounds, suffered from pneumonia, and ends up having to go back to London and kind of recuperate before he goes home. But I mean, he went through all of the wars almost in the first half of the 20th century. You know, almost. You know.
One was a willing spectator slash participant. He wanted to be there. I mean, it
Yeah.
was
Oh, and we could get into more like as far as his involvement in the Spanish Civil War and some of the things down in Cuba, where he almost gets in a little trouble of blurring the lines between a press reporter and an active participant in the war. Yeah,
soldier, huh?
yeah, yeah. And there's stories about him leading small uh, groups of fighters. But we're not going to get into all that. There's just so much we could talk about with London. So his time in World War II is just epic, right? And he's older and maybe not as active as he once was, but it just really he does some great reporting. There's some great writing on those events that occur that he does, and then also it just adds to his epic story, right? The true epic, right?
Right.
Um, so also during that time, he ends up cheating on his current wife, Martha Gellhorn, and meets a young journalist, Mary Welsh, and they have an affair. And I mean, in December 1945, he divorces Martha. March 1946, him and Mary get married. Yeah. But as far as his writing and his professional career, he kind of struggled to get any success in kind of the late 40s and the early 50s, and was really feeling kind of maybe disheartened and maybe even, I would say, probably challenged a bit by his critics. And so he kind of sat down and he wrote The Old Man in the Sea, which is a short story or a novella, if you will. And Hemingway said that that was the best that he could write.
You know,
Now,
the funny thing about that to me is that having read it just recently, you know, what you said about him feeling disheartened with his career prospects at that time. Then he sat down and wrote a story about not getting disheartened,
yeah,
basically, and
right.
experienced great
And not
success.
necessarily having success,
Oh, okay, yeah,
too, right? Is that not right?
right, right.
But we're not
That's what
talking
the
about the
story's
old man in
about.
the sea.
Right,
We're
right.
not here to talk about the old man in the sea.
But check it
Uh,
out if you get a chance. It's a good one.
yes, I would suggest it for sure. Um, you know, we've mentioned it slightly here and there over this time over his life in this adventurous life. He sustained a number of injuries to all of his body, and it just kind of continues. In '53, he takes his second trip to Africa with now his fourth wife, and has a couple plane crashes that are just some crazy stories. If you go read about that, that's interesting on its own. But ends up sustaining a pretty serious brain injury that kind of probably it probably doesn't determine the ending events of his life, but it probably sped them up,
Yeah, I'm
right?
sure it had a negative impact on his
Yeah,
overall mental health.
right. And I don't think, like I said, I think those things were probably still there, and he may have still committed suicide. But if it wasn't for this particular brain injury where he had some cerebral leakage, um, it may have been another 10 years or so. That's just, kind of just reading into things. But there were rumors of his death. He had just won the Pulitzer Prize in 1953 for The Old Man and the Sea. I mean, it was Old Man and the Sea was an instant success. He became an international celebrity. His home in Key West became a tourist stop. He hated that. Um,
People go
and
to the Hemingway house today, as far as that goes. It's a
yeah,
tourist
yeah,
attraction right now. Yeah.
I have a collection of his short stories from when my mother went to that house and she bought it for me. You know what I mean?
Nice.
Yeah. Um, but Hemingway hated it. He really wanted seclusion in his personal life as far as where he lived at and stuff like that. Um, but behind these plane crashes in Africa in '54, there's reports of him being dead. And so they award him the Nobel Prize in Literature, and he kind of felt like they gave it to him out of pity because they thought he had passed on, and they probably wouldn't have gave it to him if they knew he was alive. And he said that he really didn't care much about the prize, and mentioned another couple of guys that probably should have won it, and said, but I'll take the money though. It's kind of the sentiment. I'll take that money. Um, and so the last part of the '50s is the closing of his life. He continues to suffer from the impacts of these injuries, his continued battles with mental health, and then we hadn't really even mentioned his relationship with alcohol. And just to sum up his relationship, in an interview, he once said, I have drank since I was 15, and few things have given me as much pleasure. And just think about all that he did in his life, you know.
For
And
the drink to have that big an impact in that type of life that he lived, it's a big statement.
yeah, yeah, and we'll talk probably more about that when we get into the book, because it's certainly an overarching theme in the book as well. Um, but his alcoholism, he was always there. He was kind of a controlled alcoholic, or a managing alcoholic, if you will. But over the years of all these injuries, he's in a lot of pain, and so he's kind of drinking more because of the pain. And that kind of compounds his mental illness, which kind of turns into paranoia, which is related to some of those things we alluded to during in the activities he was involved in Cuba and during the Spanish War, Civil War, and all those different things. So I mean, he thinks the FBI is after him. He thinks Hoover is like out to get him. And J. Edgar Hoover did have an extensive file on Hemingway and some of his activities, but he wasn't necessarily after him like that, particularly at this time. You know what I mean? But he suffers from paranoia. His wife, and remember, we're in the '50s, and we really forget some of the medical techniques that were used at the time. This was a time when people were still being lobotomized. They may go through their eye to cut off a piece of the brain. Electric shock therapy was prevalent. And his wife did not understand his mental illness and his depression and how his physical ailments contributed to that. She thought he was cursed. That's what she thought. She thought this was a family curse, and really didn't know what to do, and kind of convinces him. They kind of trick him into going to the Mayo Clinic, saying this is going to be about your heart. He had hypertension and diabetes as well. And a lot of bourbon will do that to you. but he goes in convinced he's going to see the doctor about his hypertension, and it's about his mental health, and he ends up receiving at least a dozen or more electric electric convulsive therapy, which I don't know what the difference is between ECT and EST. I don't know, but kind of a horrific experience for the man. And he goes home. He lives for a little while. He ends up having to go back. He lives for a little while, and they find him in his kitchen with a shotgun. Is what really gets him to the hospital at the end. They find him in the kitchen in April, I think, of 61. Yeah, 61. They find him in the kitchen holding his shotgun. And so they get him to go to the hospital. And at that time, between April and June, he gets electric shock treatment now, and whatever that difference is. But he received electric shock treatment at least 3 times. And, he made a comment about these therapies, and it was like kind of that it cleared the mind of maybe some of the chaos and the trauma, but it also ruined his memory. And his memory was what made him a great writer, And for the past couple of years, he had found that he couldn't organize his thoughts like he once did, and he was losing what he was great at, Comes home in June 1961, July 2nd, 1961, he kills himself with that same shotgun in the basement of that same house.
That he'd been home maybe, what was it, 2-3 days?
Yeah, came home June 30th, killed himself July 2nd. And so just a tragic ending to an amazing life, and really someone that can be studied. You can just study his literature, or you can just study his life, and you can spend a really long time and learn a whole lot, right?
Well, we've of course read some of his work, and then we've also discussed just what you just said about, man, maybe we could read his biography at some point and just do a study on his life, because man, the man's lifetime was just as much or more interesting than a lot of things anybody could ever write about.
Yeah, and in 59 years,
Right.
didn't make it to 60. So really interesting. But honing back in to A Farewell to Arms, like we've mentioned a couple times, some people say that this is his greatest work. Some people have even said that this is the greatest novel ever written. Give us a brief summary of A Farewell to Arms.
So in this story, you have a young American man um, goes to Europe as part of the American Red Cross. He's driving ambulances on the Italian front, which again reminds us a lot of experience that Hemingway had in his actual life. While he's in Europe, he meets a young nurse. They develop a relationship, and then he has to go away to the front where he is faced with the realities of the war. It's kind of been like a European vacation for him up to that point, but he's on the front lines and he's in real danger and winds up getting injured, and then he's to the hospital and back into the love story. We discussed how this novel is kind of love story, war story, love story, war story, and that's not to play down either aspect. I think it kind of offers a little bit for all audiences. I think the love story plus the action. I mean, you have a little bit of everything you could want for a major motion picture. Um, there's the excitement of the battle and the leadership and relationships with him and his men under his command, and then the realities and the harsh realities of what's actually going on in Europe at the time. And then you have these sections where him and Miss Catherine are they're getting closer and closer and developing their relationship. And I don't want to give too much away, but there's a lot of really exciting things that happen to him and then to their relationship because of what's going on with him and the war in Europe. Uh, it's got everything that you could want as far as the excitement and the romance, and there's a bit of tragedy, we'll say, mixed in there. I mean, it's a war story, so things don't work out good for everybody involved. Not all the characters
Tragedy,
have a good
violence,
time with it.
death,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So,
sex,
right,
alcohol,
alcohol, right.
all those things, yeah, that make a good, compelling story, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what'd you think about it? Did you enjoy it overall, you think?
Yeah, I enjoyed it. It's an entertaining read. Even if you take it, I say this a lot, I feel like even if you just take it at face value, it's well done. And it's a good example of his writing style, which you mentioned earlier. And we talked about it during our discussions while we were reading this. It's an easy read, and it's not as, some of the writing is not as creative or maybe like poetic, like I feel some of the other authors we've studied. It's very concise, it's kind of straight to the point. There's not a whole lot of extra fluff in there to make it seem beautiful, but there's a lot of content in the writing. He says a lot with just a little bit of writing.
Yeah, and so saying that, we kind of, I feel like we noticed two things, right? In his descriptive writing of the kind of landscape and the action, was very well done. He does a really good job of kind of putting you in the scene, right?
Yeah.
And we even compare, like from some other books that we've read, we think about the Seawolf and Jack London's work and him putting you in that scene, and maybe Grapes of Wrath and Of Mice and Men with Steinbeck, and Steinbeck placing you in that scene. But what we found was his dialogue, right? Amongst some of the characters, particularly the love interest, we found, maybe fell flat and wasn't maybe as pretty, in the prose, and really comparing that to who we just did with Zora Neale Hurston, who in her prose you could hear the accent, right? And
With all
same thing with,
pros.
yeah,
Yeah.
and the same thing with like Jack London, right? You could
Right.
hear the accents of the different ethnicities. All of Hemingway's prose is done in the first person. It is the
Right.
uh, upper middle class Chicago guy, or would you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. That's a pretty accurate description according to what we've studied.
Yeah, but it's also like, you said, it is very simple, but those simple conversations between regular people hold a whole lot, right? As humans,
Hmm.
we speak in symbols and in metaphors, and it's often about what's not said, right? Yeah, and so that is interesting, in that kind of less is more writing style. And then we also kind of picked out, and you said it, those breaks, and that was another part of Hemingway's style, as far as having breaks in the work. And you mentioned how, it kind of started off with this war setting, and then setting up this romantic relationship, and then it was really a back and forth from the war to the romantic, to a war to the romantic. um, and we kind of thought maybe that was a nod to Tolstoy. You remember we kind of talked about that being a
Hmm.
nod to Leo Tolstoy, and War and Peace,
One
and this A
piece.
Farewell to Arms being just overall kind of a continuation of that type of thought. Um, and that's some of the argument folks make for it being the greatest novel ever written, because some other folk, those same folks, would have said the one that was great before that was War and Peace, right? And some of those
Hmm.
connections can make that for it. Um, so that kind of breaks down maybe some of the highlights of the writing aspect of it, right? What about some of these themes that we brought out while reading this? We talked about the alcoholism, right? We talked about sex.
Hmm.
Um, talked about the horrors of war and the realities of war.
Posters of leadership.
Pressures of leadership. Leadership was a theme, right? Yeah, we kind of throughout this thing was making a leadership study out of. Hold on one second. I'm gonna mute myself for 1 second. I apologize about that. Bodie's trying to take over the show there. You know how it
He's
goes.
trying to
He's
make a little guest appearance.
man, he is just all about himself. He's the star, and it's probably the truth. Um, so what about these themes? Let's talk about that a little bit. What stood out most to you, or maybe where would you want to start?
Uh, I like the presence of leadership. I mean, that was the thing that really stood out to me. I mean, the alcoholism is prevalent throughout the whole thing. That's probably like one of, if not the major theme, one of for sure. But
Well, and just to pause on that, and we won't spend too much
yeah,
time on it, but in the idea of the less is more, it's like it's not like focused on, but it's
right,
always there, right? In
right,
some way or another. Keep it going.
yeah. Um, when we talk about the pressures of leadership in the wartime scenario where he's a leader of men and he's got these responsibilities for not just his men but hospital equipment. They're ambulance drivers, so he's responsible for the vehicles and for the equipment when they move from one place to another as the war front moves across Europe. And then also leadership in the relationship that he was in, and how his level of success as far as a leader was different in each scenario. Is
Yeah,
that a
yeah.
good way to put it, you think?
I think that's a very good way to put it. And we're not going to go into the deep analysis of that leadership study, but it is there's two aspects of it for sure, and
Hmm.
he shows different levels and different types of leadership, and she shows leadership as well, right? There's different aspects of that whole study. Um, Another theme that I felt that we brought out, which is really important, I think, to Ernest Hemingway. Just we don't want to blur the lines between his life and his work, but looking at his life and looking at his work, mental health was a really important theme in this book. But what we found interesting was that in what 1929, when this novel was published, the vocabulary, the language that we have now to talk about mental health and depression and anxiety and bipolar and manic, all these different things, they didn't have that language. They didn't have the same understanding of mental health and mental illness. And he's really dealing with some deep themes with the main character's mental health, the love interest mental health, the other different kind of secondary and tertiary characters, right? Um, I just feel like that's it's a very interesting aspect of the novel, and he's dealing with something deep there that really he doesn't have the language to deal with. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And even for decades after it was published, still the same situation persisted. And that, I, of course, I'm not an expert on the subject, but I would think the lack of information and the vocabulary and all that is probably contributed to why they felt like it was a good idea to start drilling holes in people's heads and things like that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
today, you're like, what in the world would you do? Would you lobotomize somebody for? But they thought that was a legitimate treatment in that time.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, and we can get into the whole kind of overarching philosophy of societies or the philosophy of medicine at the time, but really treating people like objects, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, yeah. Well, there is so much that we could spend a whole lot of time on. What do you think have we missed, or do we need to highlight more and kind of maybe wrapping it up?
Well, I feel like we don't want to give too much detail on the story, and saying that it's a romance, it's a love story set in wartime. That's accurate, but there's so much more to the wartime story. I mean, it's a good tale as far as that goes. It's an entertaining read. It's not like if you hear us saying love story, and you think, oh man, this is not something I'd be interested in. Think again. I think that if you give it a chance, that it could be an entertaining read for anybody who was willing to indulge in it. There was a lot of good stuff with the action and the decisions and sacrifices that had to be made. It all had a very realistic feel to it when you're reading it. Like man, and some very difficult things to go through. Uh, I enjoyed it. I liked it quite a bit.
Yeah, and maybe we have focused on the love story aspect of it, and it does overtake the plot. But it's kind of a love story set within a war story.
Yeah,
And those description of war is very vivid. Like we said earlier, those descriptions of the landscapes and how the action occurred, and it's his journalistic chops coming through in that, right? Um, yeah, he puts you in the action, and there's a lot of action. There's a lot of action for sure, for sure. And that doesn't even, one of the other themes that we kind of looked at was maybe the American view of the situation in Europe
yeah, war in Europe.
and the Europeans' view of what's
Right.
going on here, and even in maybe the bourgeois view versus the regular guy,
Yeah.
So there's there's something in there for everybody, right?
Yeah, definitely.
But the action is in there enough to keep you rolling, even if it's maybe not all the way for you. I guess I don't know if that makes any sense, but critically, let's we can brag on it a lot, but to look from the critical perspective, some of the dialogue is rather weak, right? It to me almost, and it may be because of my bias, right? The action, the war part of it, um, through the beginning and the middle parts of the book is the better parts, um, and some of the dialogue just gets a little sappy, right? A little corny,
Yeah.
right?
A little
For
bit. Yeah.
sure. Um, but as we discussed, at the same time, when you're sitting there pillow talking with your significant other, some of those little playful, intimate conversations become like that, right?
Right. Which in turn makes the writing all the more realistic.
Right, exactly. Um, but in this idea of less is more, you know, um, the mention of abortion is just very briefly mentioned, and it's just like something that if it's less is more, there's a whole lot more to it than what was just there. And then I'm not sure if I'm being critical of Hemingway himself or if I'm being critical of our character, Frederick Henry. But the Othello comment in the book, where he refers to Othello as the N word, and that's kind of all that is really mentioned in that idea of racism. I don't know if the more is Hemingway's racism or if the more is his commentary on racism. And I just don't know enough. I don't know enough, I guess, about it. But just looking at what we do know about Hemingway, he was probably a racist piece of crap. Just like he was a
Possibility.
just like he was a misogynistic piece of
Right.
crap. You know what I'm
Mhm.
saying? And so, although he is a great artist, was a great artist, he was also a troubled, and broken individual. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's an accurate assessment.
Well, cool. Well, and what else you got to say about that? What's your kind of critique or overall view of Hemingway and A Farewell to Arms?
So it took me some time. It probably I chose to read The Old Man and the Sea while we were reading this at the same time, just to get a little more exposure to Hemingway's work. And I thought kind of what we've stated, that the dialogue, some of the writing falls almost a little flat, but I'm also comparing them to these other really great authors that we've studied just recently, who have a different style, and it's maybe you might call them a little more flashy.
Well, and
Hemingway
so
doesn't have the same flash as like a Jack London, for instance.
yeah,
But that doesn't mean that his work is lesser quality. It's just a
yeah,
different style. And you might would think that it's I can see how a person might think it of lesser quality, but you have to do a little more thinking. Like you said, a lot is said with less writing. So you read between the lines, like,
yeah.
and so that comes down to the individual reader's ability to do that sort of thing, or willingness to engage in that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's a little bit of what Hemingway was trying to do, and we see that in those two works that you mentioned. You can kind of see that in the endings, maybe if
Yeah.
somebody wanted to go read those two things, and maybe you could come back and talk with us about it. So, and it's really interesting to me, because we just came off of Zora Neale Hurston, who was a pioneer in prose, right? Um, but if we're going to compare the two, I'll be honest and I'll say I don't think Zora represents the landscape as well as
Yeah.
Hemingway does, right? But then I say Hemingway is not do as well with dialogue and prose and representing, in A Farewell to Arms, I hear no accent in the Italians' uh, prose in their dialogue with Italian. I don't really hear any accent, even though some things are kind of written different, so you know that they're saying it different, but it doesn't ever sound any different in my head. When I'm reading Hurston or London or some others, I can hear that that accent. But the flip side of it is that descriptive writing in the landscape and the activity. Um, so I can definitely see that comparison, particularly coming off of Their Eyes Were Watching God. All right. Well, that's cool. So I'm really excited about what we've talked about doing next. And the biggest thing is because we're kind of, one thing is this person has been greatly impactful on my life, but we're also getting to transition in genres of literature, and we've kind of chosen to look at an essay. Talk to us a little bit about what we're going to do next.
So we're doing a study on an essay by Henry David Thoreau called Civil Disobedience. Very well known, and I'm sure has been inspirational to a lot of different political figures throughout the course of our lifetimes and before that even. Uh, it's it's what's a good way to summarize that? It's about his ideal, what would make an ideal government is the main thing that he's writing about in this essay. Very thought provoking. And it sounds funny to say we're doing a study on an essay. We're doing it over the course of weeks, even though it's only like 21, 22 pages,
Yeah,
but there's so much in it. Uh, it's, it was relevant a couple hundred years ago. It's relevant today. It'll always be relevant. The things that he's written about in there. Definitely worthwhile if you get a chance. Check out a copy of Civil Disobedience by Thoreau. Probably have to get that from your local library or maybe online, something like that. But give it a read and open your mind up a little bit. It's really something.
yeah, and tap in with us too on any of these things
Yeah,
that we've read or put out there. Hey, tap in, read it. If you agree with us, if you disagree with us, we'd love to talk about it. Um,
absolutely.
And yeah, I'm really excited to get into Henry David Thoreau and civil disobedience with you. I think it's pretty important for any citizen of the United States of America to
I
have
would agree with
read
that.
Thoreau. All right.
Yep.
Well, anything else, Big Dog?
I think that about wraps it up.
All right. This has been Book Club, Maxwell 3000 Productions. I am Maxwell 3000. Peace and love.